Join me in prayer. God, as we share in this resurrection story, we give thanks for new life, for a message of hope, for a message of renewal, for a reminder every day that the worst thing is never the last thing. So be with us today. Open our hearts, our spirits. Make us new and renew us to send us back into the world, new people. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Oh, don't you think it's time for a really bad joke? Don't you like it when I pull out some of my bad jokes here? All right, well, you don't have a choice. I'm going to anyway. So here it is. There are these three people. They're at the pearly gates of heaven, and St. Peter tells them they can only enter if they answer this simple question, what is Easter? So the first one says, oh, that's easy. It's the holiday in November when everyone gets together, eats turkey, and are thankful. Wrong, he says. So he proceeds to ask the second person, what is Easter? And that person said, oh, that's easy. It's the holiday in December when we put up nice trees, exchange presents, and celebrate the birth of Jesus. Oh, he's exacerbated. The third one comes along. What is Easter, he asks. Immediately, the person says, Easter is the Christian holiday that coincides with the Jewish celebration of Passover. Jesus and his disciples were eating at the Last Supper, and Jesus was later deceived and turned over to the Romans by one of his disciples. The Romans took him to be crucified, and he was stabbed in the side, made to wear a crown of thorns, and he was hung on a cross with nails through his hands. He was buried in a nearby cave, which was sealed off by a large boulder. St. Peter is so pleased. He thinks finally someone gets it. At that point, he continues. And every year, the boulder is moved aside so that Jesus can come out, and if he sees his shadow, there will be 6 more weeks of winter. So bad, right? Well, this is the morning. Oh, my sermon's going to blow away. I'll just hold it here. This is the morning where we ask ourselves, what is Easter? And Easter is our defining story. We started at the birth of Jesus as we made our way through his ministry, his life, and his death on Friday. And now we are here and we get to proclaim we are Easter people. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. What a gift the story of the resurrection is. But here is the fundamental truth, or not but here is the fundamental truth. We all experience crucifixions in our lives. We experience these dark moments, these painful moments, these moments of despair, intense grief. We have heartache. We are going to experience moments in life when it seems like evil or darkness or pain has had the upper hand. And in the Easter story, we're going to find out that darkness, that evil, that pain, that hate does not prevail. And as I said in my prayer, the words of Frederick Buechner are true. We're going to find out that the worst thing is never the last thing. And so what I'm going to invite you today to think about is while we are going to live the crucified life, that's sort of part of our day-to-day life, I'm going to invite you to choose to live a resurrection life. And that, as Jesus said, that we find a life that really is life. And in that we find joy. And that we find peace. In that we find strength. In that we find hope. So you saw as the young people were making this beautiful interactive story, you know the story that got us here today. Jesus was with his disciples as they made their way into Jerusalem. They were celebrating the Passover meal, and on Thursday night they have their meal together. After the meal, they go down to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus says, stay here while he goes, and he prays. He prays with such fervent prayer, and it says, he says to God, take this cup of suffering from me, not my will, but thy will be done. And at that moment, Judas comes, who has betrayed him, and brings with him an army, and they arrest Jesus. Jesus is taken to the home of the high priest, and a court is called that night, and he is found guilty of blasphemy. So the next day they take him to the governor, and the governor cannot find a reason that he is worthy of death, but it says in the story, wishing to satisfy the crowds, they sentence him to death, and he's nailed to a cross, which is a sign of torture and evil and hate in the world, and he dies. And it feels like, at this point in the story, it feels like love has died. It feels like evil has won. See, that's not hard for us to believe. Anne Lamott, who wrote a wonderful book about faith, she's written several books, in fact, says, we are Easter people living in a Good Friday world. All you have to do is simply wake up. Listen to the news, read the news, make your way into the world to know that it doesn't feel that unnatural, uncommon to think, gosh, love has died. Where is God in all of the pain in our world? In 1963, there was a bombing at the 16th Street Mall in 16th Street Church, mall, it's in my mind, church in Burlington, Alabama, where 4 children were killed that day. There were members of the KKK who took dynamite and stuck it under the steps of the church building. And the plan was that it would detonate right between, as the children, just think about that for a minute, intentionally, as the children were moving from their Sunday morning children's ministry to church. And as it did, 4 children were killed. Dr. King preached 3 of the 4 sermons for the memorial services for those children that day. And this is what he says. He said, at times, life is hard as crucible steel. It has its bleak and painful moments. Like the ever-flowing water of a river, life has its moments of droughts and its moments of flood. Like the ever-changing cycle of the season, life has the soothing warmth of the summer and the piercing chill of the winters. But through it all, God walks with us. See, we all experience crucifixion, these moments where you wonder, where are you, God? You might be walking through one of those moments right now. And what we need to hear when we are living in these moments is the Easter story. Each of the Gospels share a different resurrection story, which I love because it reminds us that each of us have a different experience of the living Christ. In each of the Gospel stories, you find despair, you find fear, you find uncertainty, and finally, when they see Jesus as the living Christ, and Jesus says, peace be with you. The word for peace in the Greek is restoration, is wholeness. And in that moment, in every one of the gospel stories, they are changed. See, the resurrection of Jesus changes everything. Easter changes everything. Easter changes despair into hope, grief into joy. They find in the midst of their darkness, they see light. See, that's the resurrection story. In it, there is peace. In it, there is joy. In it, there is hope. In it, there is light. This is the resurrection life. This is what you are invited into today. See, in the resurrection life, we are changed. We have a change of mind, which leads to a change of heart, which leads to a change of action. Fred Craddock, who was a well-known 20th century preacher, one of my very favorites, would say in his very slow Southern drawl, which I no longer have, but he would say, Christians don't just need to be nice, they need to be changed. Don't go saying that you get to now not be nice. The pastor said so. That's not what I'm saying. But there's power in being changed in the resurrection story in our lives. And if you and I internalize the resurrection, then no matter what we face, you will know it never has the final word. See, Easter invites us to live into this truth, to live the resurrection life. There's a story that I read that a Presbyterian pastor told of a member of her church who was a well-known professor in her particular community, and he worked at a prestigious university, and he had this prestigious life until he found his life overcome with addiction. He tumbled into a dark hole, and he lost his family. He lost his place in the world. And as she told the story, and as he told the story, he said slowly, through his recovery, he was able to find his way out of that dark place. One night, she and her husband had him over for dinner, and he began to tell this story of what he was going through in his life. He said, I want to believe that my best days aren't behind me, that my life can still count, can still make a difference. He sat at his table as he was struggling, and he said, I just can't help but feel like I've blown all my best chances. She described that was just when his wife took his hands, reached over, and said to him, honey, you've got to take your sticky fingers off that steering wheel. If God can yank Jesus out of a grave, I figure he can make something beautiful out of all of our busted parts. Father Henri Nouwen said it this way: the resurrection is God's way of revealing to us that nothing that belongs to God will ever go to waste. What belongs to God will never get lost, including you and including me. Mark Twain has this quote: the two most important days of your life are the day you are born and the day you find out why. When living a resurrection life, your why becomes one where you show light in the midst of the darkness, hope in the midst of despair, love in the midst of hate, healing in the midst of pain. You become like the risen Christ. There are so many stories among us that highlight the way in which this is lived out. But I wanted to just have you take a look at this video to see how one teacher made a difference in the life of a child. Take a look.
I have a lot of memories from when I was a child. One that's always stuck out to me, though, was when I was about 10 years old, and I was in school, and I struggled. And I didn't struggle with English, math, or science. I struggled holding still. And I would try to listen and focus and process ideas, but I couldn't help myself. And to be honest, I would sit there and then I would just start tapping. And the students in the class would look at me and they'd say, hey, stop tapping. A lot of the time, I didn't even realize I was doing it. And then eventually even the teachers got after me and they would yell at me and they'd say, Clint, you have to stop tapping. It got so bad that I got sent to the principal's office for tapping. And he said to me, okay, maybe when you go back to class, just try sitting on your hands. And so I did. I went back to class, and when I felt myself starting to tap, I did this. I sat on my hands. And that worked for about 5 seconds. One time I was tapping in class, and my teacher, Mr. Jensen, he looked at me and he yelled. And he said, "Clint, stay after class." And I thought to myself, this is it. I am done. Now, I've always been the type of person that believes that a single moment in time can change a person's life. And this was one of those moments for me, and I will never forget it. And so I was sitting there with Mr. Jensen and an empty classroom. And he walked past me and he sat next to his desk and he said, "Clint, come here. I want to talk to you." And as he looked me right in the eye, he said, "Now, I need you to know something. You're not in trouble. But I do have just one question that I have to ask you." And he asked, he said, "Have you ever thought about playing the drums?" And in that moment, Mr. Jensen, he leaned back and he opened the top drawer of his desk. And he reached in and he pulled out my very first pair of drumsticks. And he held them in his hands and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, Clint, you're not a problem. I think you're a drummer." And from that moment on, I've never put those sticks down. I've toured, recorded, and played drums all over the world. My whole college education was paid for with drumsticks in my hand. Just because of a single moment in time when somebody believed in me and he saw something in me that I didn't even see within myself. And from that moment, I learned that there's a difference between being the best in the world and being the best for the world.
Teachers, doctors, engineers, service industry, accountants, police officers, the list could go, biologists, the list could go on and on. That might be your job, but your purpose is seeing the best in others, is living into a resurrection life, is showing up every day to remember the worst thing is never the last thing, to offer hope and love and light in a hurting world. That is the Easter story. So my hope for you and for me as we remember our defining story is that we live it in the world today, tomorrow, and every day. Happy Easter.